Hello and welcome. I am hot off of the Bat Sim High Chapter 1 reading, so I'm going to try and stick with my regular voice and not slip into any of those character voices that I try to roll out for those readings. They are a little rough sometimes. Didn't quite get my PhD in voice acting, so do my best, but okay, I'm going to stick with the regular voice for now. What I'd like to review or look at in this episode is actually looking back through 2024 and noting a couple of the inflection points and the interesting details of the year, and then look ahead to 2025 and get a sense for the goals that I have for the new year and what I hope to kind of share here through the podcast next year. So, this was obviously the first year for the podcast, and no idea what it was going to be like. I think we covered a lot of different bases, and I guess starting in the very beginning, when I first started this podcast, the goal was to create a space for me to practice, for me to reflect and teach myself um, things I didn't know about writing, make connections I hadn't made before. And a lot of this came from the idea that the best form of learning is to teach. I certainly experienced that during the time that I taught students. But teaching myself was kind of the principal idea at play here. And like I said, creating a space for me to practice. So having some sort of incentive to create something new with some regularity, and to do more than I would without the podcast. I think that might be the most succinct way of saying it. So, looking back through the year, we actually did quite a variety of different projects. I'm not sure that I've ever actually added it up, but we wrote pre-battle trimmers, which was very short, but was something. An Unbarren Castle, that was a longer piece. The Questing Cook Blueprint, that was another big project. The Jester's Son, we outlined that novel, which is what I'll kind of close today by introducing and discussing. And then recorded the Hazeltop audiobook. That was kind of an extended project. We did a couple sort of brainstorming episodes, and then we got into the bedtime stories. So this was a really fun kind of conclusion to the year for me. I've never written a bedtime story before. I wrote, it looks like maybe 5 or 6 here in the last 2 months, and each of those was really fun. I have enjoyed listening to them. I've had a few nieces and nephews that have tuned in as well and kind of gotten a kick out of them. So that's been a really fun genre for me to start to explore and actually hone or try to hone some skills in the very short story area. And then just lately here, I recorded, like I mentioned, the Bat Sim High chapter. So that was another sort of unique piece. And then I've got currently 2 drafts that I've started for different stories that are near complete but are not quite ready to share. So at some point in that list, I lost track of my fingers that I was counting on, but I think we wound up somewhere in the order of 10 or, yeah, let's call it 10 different stories through the year, different projects, maybe let's say 10 to 12 different projects, which is not too bad, especially considering some of them are on the larger side. I keep kind of a pseudo-accurate log of kind of the hours invested on each project, and I can kind of look at the distribution of the energy and the time across these projects. Most of them were very easy. There's 3 that kind of stand out, and I think I want to maybe spend a little bit of time on each one of these just to reflect on them and share a little bit of what I learned by working on them. So all of January was really the first couple of episodes. No big projects through January, but as we got into February, I started the Unbarren Castle draft. So this was something we'd brainstormed in episodes 3 and 4. I'm very thankful for my Excel sheet here that's got all these numbers. Something we brainstormed in episodes 3 and 4. And then I took about 55 hours in February and March and drafted that out. I think that story came out to about 13,000 words, if I'm remembering correctly. But it was a very interesting idea, kind of a plot device that was interesting, but also the thematic arc of the story was one I've never written sort of a redemptive arc like that before. I can't say that I did it well. I don't really know, but I certainly did my best. And this story in particular, I did a whole sort of author notes reflection on it back, I would assume, in March or April, with more accurate reflections than I'll share now. But broadly speaking, one thing that I really learned from this story was kind of the power of a character writing themselves. This is something you hear authors talk about where, a character had a mind of their own and the character was supposed to complete plot device X, but they had such a life of their own that they created plot device Y, and it wasn't part of the original plan, and it sort of shook things up. I hadn't experienced that with many characters, but let's see, I believe, his name was Mason. Mason from the Unbarren Castle came onto the page with more humor and kind of more vivacity is the word I want to use, mostly because that sounds fancy, but he had more potency, more kick to him than I had expected. And, some writers will speak like that's the character, speaking for themselves. I'll just say in more honestly that the first scene I wrote with him was just quite humorous, and after reading that, I decided, okay, I'm actually just going to change his character, and he's going to play a larger role in this story. And because he did have such kind of an entertaining entrance, I wanted to try to carry that through. So what that means practically is that in the later scenes where he appears, I massaged those scenes or tweaked them so that he was able to make more humorous comments. So there's the two kind of dunce guards that stand outside the door, and I made them duncy so that he could kind of dunk on them a little bit at a few points. Had Mason not made that funny entrance, if it had been serious or whatever, I would have made the guards differently. They would have been smarter, more discerning, more wondering what the Baron was up to. And Mason may have needed to play a different role. Maybe he would have had to distract them or talk them down or even fight them potentially. But that, whoops. But since his kind of initial entrance was that humorous one, I was able to try to massage the story around that. So that was one thing I learned from the Unbarren Castle story. I think another was just project management. It was 2 months of the year where I pretty much only worked on this project. I didn't record any episodes. I just worked on it. And since, I wrote Hazeltop in 2023 and kind of finished that in December. 2 months, a 2-month break between big projects might not sound like a lot, but I think for me, I think there was a bit of a learning curve to get back into a sizable project where you do need to invest a lot of time. So I think, that was another growth point for me with the Unbarren Castle. Now moving on, the next big project was the Jester's Son outline. So I've got 150 hours invested in this, and excuse me. What the outline is, obviously, is an outline of the Jester's Son, which is the novel that I will be working on in 2025. And I'm going to get into more detail on that process specifically, I think, towards the tail end of this episode. But I want to walk through this outline first of all, and I don't have it pulled up or anything like that, but I just want to give you the impression or the idea of what I was trying to do with this. So, what I've observed from the two novels that I've worked on or written so far, the first was something like 6 or 7 years ago, and I'd heard of this distinction that authors have where some are pantsers and some are architects, or gardeners and architects. These are different terms you might hear. Gardeners being authors that choose a starting point and they just write the story from there. They don't maybe necessarily know how it's going to end, or they don't know all the twists and turns, but they know their characters well, and they know how to watch their characters play through a story. The other type of writer being the architect. These folks have everything mapped out. They know the last sentence before they write the first, and they're able to manage their way through the book. Being a younger, naiver, is that a word? More naive writer, I decided I was probably a pantser because that sounded easier and more fun. So I started The Age of Amber, the very first novel I ever worked on, with just kind of the sketch of an outline, not a lot of detail. Now, 3 years into that, I was halfway done. I deleted tens of thousands of words and rewritten it because it, when I started, there were werewolves in one country, and the magic worked one way. And then in chapter 20, I realized the magic needed to work this way, and oh yeah, werewolves were long gone. So there was a lot of waste in that process. So what happened for Hazeltop was I came up with a little 20-page outline, and it had a section for each chapter. Let's say maybe 500 words per chapter, maybe less. But I had about 20 pages with a good gist of the story. Now, that was very helpful. I thought that was great. I was ready to do that again for the Jester's Son. And not necessarily by a conscious choice, I began outlining. And as I, got into the outline for chapter 1 and then chapter 2 and a couple more, all of a sudden I was at 20 pages. And the volume was much, much more than I'd anticipated. So I'd gotten into much, much more detail in those initial chapter outlines than I had with Hazeltop. And I think what I realized, at that inflection point, at that decision point, was that this is going to be really helpful. The more I can put into the outline, the easier the drafting will be. And it may seem like a duplication of effort or a non-efficiency to do so much work on an outline that is never going to see the page for the reader. But for me, at least, the outline is easy. It's it did take me, let's say, 3 months to develop, but it's not difficult mental work. It's very exciting, and in fact, it's probably the most fun aspect of writing for me is that that moment when you associate two ideas that haven't been connected before, or you come up with a new character name or a quirky trait or a plot mechanic that all of a sudden adds a little bit of life into a chapter or a sequence. That's really the fun part for me. So I really enjoyed coming up with this outline. I think I may have mentioned it earlier, but the Jester's Son will be 50 chapters, so it's going to be quite a bit larger than Hazeltop, and I'm anticipating it to be in that 150,000 to maybe 175,000 word area. So it's going to be a much bigger project. I think Hazeltop rounded out at about 60,000. So there's that. In terms of the contents of the Jester's Son, I'll, like I said, introduce that at the end of the episode here. But while we're talking about the outline, one more area I think that I really grew in was the outlining area, obviously, but being able to zero in on arcs. So I think for Hazeltop, my outline was focused on plot. It was 95%. Here's what's happening in the chapter. And in the Jester's Son outline, we got into much more of, okay, in this chapter, Davis, my main character, this is the arc he's on, and it's continuing from the previous chapter. We're progressing it in this chapter, and then in 2 more chapters, we're going to round this out and move on to the next arc. So there was, I think, much more of a thematic continuity described in the outline. So that was something that was not present in Hazeltop that I think I've implemented in the Jester's Son. And then the world building, I think I flexed the world building muscles here as I was brainstorming this new world. Let's just talk about the Jester's Son now. Don't need to save it for later. So this story takes place in the same universe, the same world as Hazeltop. So the 2-sentence, 3-sentence description of Hazeltop is there's a magic school. Somebody from another continent, or a group of people from another continent, don't like magic. So they send sort of a spy group. They send over a somebody to try and take out this magical school. And the heroes of Hazeltop must kind of band together to save the school and stop the person. So Jester's Son takes place on the continent that is anti-magic. So we've now shifted to quote unquote the enemy's perspective. Now, a couple reasons for this. One, I already invested the mental work to create something of a world for Hazeltop, so I figured, hey, there's not a lot of people that have read Hazeltop. I can just shift to a different continent, and it's, I save a lot of hours of developing worldly things. So that was a thought. Another was it'd be kind of fun to develop a couple novels that brush elbows, and sort of do a Legendarium, a Cosmere-esque, thing where they do exist together and they overlap to some degree, and you get to recognize places and people from other stories. So that's why the Jester's Son takes place in the same world. The novel follows Davis Jester, who is the son of Harold Jester. They are, I should say, Harold is the Jester of Woden. It is a city, a large city. There's several fiefs in the barony, which is the name of this country. There's several fiefs. Each has a specialty. So Woden is the fief of music. There's similarly ones for commerce, manufacturing, agriculture, war, things like this. And my goal was, one, I think it's an interesting governmental, societal structure. But 2, by specializing each of these fiefs, it makes it very interesting as the characters move through, because the question is, how does life evolve when X is the priority? So what does your society or your city look like when war is the primary or the highest order? What does it look like when music is the highest order? So what we see in Woden, the city where Davis is, the music fief, what we see in Woden is that there's a superabundance of taverns. And I would say this is what I'm most proud of from a world building perspective. I've given each tavern a really interesting identity. I could spend a lot of time talking about them, but over the course of the novel, you'll see probably 10 to 15 taverns that at different points play key roles, and they reflect the clientele of that area within the city. They reflect interesting world building or areas of lore. And my goal was to give each tavern, like I said, a very interesting identity. Um, so that's kind of one of the manifestations of life in Woden is it's the city of 1,000 taverns is a saying. And music is hugely popular there. Story is super popular, and we're going to see relative to the other fiefs how those can be leveraged by Davis to kind of do what he wants, while also getting in lots of trouble along the way. So the what else to say? Oh, I don't necessarily want to. I will give the 3-line description of the story. So the arc of the Jester's son follows follows Davis. He wants to be the Jester. He loves uh, the prestige of being the Jester of Woden, the most prestigious city in which to be a Jester. He loves his dad, who is the Jester, and there's a conflict between them as he seeks to take his dad's kind of role. Harold, his dad, has reasons to not give up that role easily, and that's going to create further conflict. And it's going to lead them across the barony. It's going to lead to connections with, or I should say, rather, friction as Davis meets someone that his father has reasons to push him away from, and ultimately I think it's going to resolve in a satisfying way. But that's the core of this novel. Is it's really Davis's transition from being a boy to being being a man, and that sounds very trite, but it's his assumption of responsibility and place in this new world. So I think that's a really worthy theme to invest time in, and that's kind of the heart of this new novel. So that was the Jester's Son outline. That was April to July of this year. Moving forward, the next project was the Questing Cook Blueprint. So this was something we brainstormed actually in episodes 5 through 7. So this was a video game centered around the player would play as a cook and collect ingredients and make food for their adventuring party. And then what I said in those episodes was, hey, in these 3 episodes, we came up with some neat ideas. I'm going to go ahead and develop a blueprint, whatever that means, right? I'm going to develop a blueprint for this video game so that if there was ever someone out there that said, hey, this sounds like a great game, I'd love to make it. Maybe I have some skill in a, a game engine. I'd love to make this. My goal was they could take this blueprint and it would have enough details and information and, the sort of substructure of the game that they wouldn't need to brainstorm stuff. They just need to focus on the development side. So that was the project for April through October primarily. It was about 120 hours to develop 2 documents, which sounds pretty puny in the end. But I can't remember the word count it came out to, but it was maybe 10 to 15,000 or 20,000 words. So it was a pretty sizable. Actually, it was probably more like 10 to 12,000. Yeah. So it was a pretty sizable document, but what that entailed was a lot of spreadsheet values of different variables and different factors for certain items and ingredients and just coming up with values and different gameplay mechanics. It was lots of fun, sort of applying different things I've appreciated from video games over the years and trying to distill them down into the framework or the idea of the questing cook, and identify what would be a fun addition, what would be the most satisfying, leanest way we could add that in, and then what does that practically look like. A lot of the time for this was spent writing descriptions for different things. So again, I'm just going offhand here, but I think I came up with maybe 300 or 350 ingredients that would be in this game. And each ingredient had different values for, we don't need to get into too many of the details, but each character has different sliders for certain characteristics. So I believe they were mind, strength, stamina, and fullness. So those are 4 attributes that you want to basically fill up so that your characters are satisfied and can go out and do their quests. So for each ingredient, I came up with their values for those 4 attributes, plus things like price, the description of the item that would show to the player, and the kind of developer notes side of it, where it would be kind of a description of where the item would be found, what it would do, how it would interact, what its likelihood was to be found by the player, things like that. So long story short, there was lots of kind of very menial, nitpicky work, and also a lot of writing of the player-facing text, because every item, every ingredient, every magical spell, every curse, every quest has a description, obviously, that the player is going to read to know what it is. So there was lots of little details for this project, and that's something I think that I grew in, was breaking down a large idea into the actual deliverables. In thinking through the blueprint, there were lots of things that I thought of that I had not kind of off the bat, and if I hadn't created the blueprint, I would never have zeroed in on those different things, such as, let's see, well, just the player facing text of, well, let me give a different example because I already mentioned that. So in the game, it's an iteratively based game where the players complete or send their parties out to complete quests. Prior to that, you have to choose which of the quests you'd like the players to do. And what I learned or realized by creating this blueprint is that in creating a quest, you have 2 options. Let's say 3 options. One, you can come up with 1,000 quest names yourself. So you can just invest a ton of time and just brute force create. Here are 1,000 quest titles, and here are the sub descriptions for each of them. Boy, that sounds like a lot of work. You can use some AI model to come up with them yourself. I don't have that, so I went for the middle ground, which is, let's invent a framework in which certain terms can be substituted while still retaining the original value. So let's say, for example, the quest is to slay a beast. You can come up with the skeleton of the quest title. So let's say it's something like to slay a blank. Now you can go ahead and create a variable or a placeholder or whatever in that blank and give 50 beast names. So you might have dragon, minotaur, troll, zombie, whatever the case is. And then all of a sudden you've created 50 different quest titles for essentially the work of one skeleton. And likewise, you can substitute maybe the description of the quest with the same variable. So that's a concept that I applied in a lot of areas where I was able to essentially randomize something based off of having a skeleton or a template in which different variables, names, titles, whatever, could be inputted. So there were a lot of cases like that where I hadn't realized, practically it would be difficult to create a lot of variability for the player. And I should add here, at the risk of wasting or spending too much time, that creating that variability was important for me because replayability is so important. You don't want to have a video game that has 3 quests and every time it's, oh boy, I'm doing the dragon slaying quest again. Click, click, click. You want to have a little bit of freshness in there. So I did that for the quests, and then something that's probably more interesting, and maybe I should have started with, is at a point in the game, all of the characters in the party produce dialogue, produce text. And I had a lot of fun with this because for each character, I came up with maybe 25 to 50 different quotes. And my intention was, by strategically creating the quotes and then asking, the developer to randomly select one of them each time we enter this dialogue phase. If every character randomly selects one, it should create some sort of conversation or dialogue or interesting interaction for the player to observe. So that was a really interesting challenge for me, was come up with 50 pieces of dialogue for one character that poke at something, question something, laugh at something in a way that is precise yet broad enough that, assuming the other 5 characters are also laughing, poking, questioning something, there's going to be enough overlap that it seems, if not intentional, at least connected. So yeah, coming up with, I think there's maybe 15 characters in there, so 15 times 50, you can do the the math on how many that shakes out to, but different things like that. So anyway, long story short, that is done. I've uploaded the blueprint to the website. I've also added a link to the website on the chapters for the Quest and Cook brainstorming. So, as of now, as of a couple months ago, actually, anyone is able to go ahead and download that and start making it. Now, lastly, I'll kind of try to round this out quickly. The latter part of the year was spent on bedtime stories, so that was a great genre for me to get into. Super, super fun. I've really appreciated working on them because they are so short. So it's really easy for me to just choose, here's a skill I want to develop. And I'm going to take, 5 to 10 hours and just write a little story that I'm going to need to lean on this skill that maybe isn't my strong suit. I'm going to need to lean on it and get some practice with it. So that's been great. It's great to introduce something fresh by doing a new story. And my long-term goal is to develop some kind of a collection of bedtime stories. So that may shake out to something like, 20 to 30 bedtime stories. Enough that it is kind of a respectable, little book that, you feel like you're not holding a packet of sticky notes, but you've got something pretty decent there that you can hold and read to some kids. So that's a long-term goal there, is to keep developing, these short stories, these bedtime stories, and compile them. Now, just recently, I did release a BatSim High chapter. This is, oh boy, It was a very fun idea. It is a very fun idea. Because the Jester's Son is on the horizon, I don't believe I'll be pursuing Batsum High right now. But the idea at the core of it was really interesting. And the idea, or the reason I devoted about 10 hours or so over the last, I would say, week and a half, was that um, it's it has the potential to be a novel. There's plenty of grit or not grit but material around this idea that you could very easily write a novel around it. And I am going to be writing a novel soon, so I figured, hey, it's a good time to go ahead and write a chapter one, kind of shake off some of the cobwebs of that particular skill set. And also, the narrator for Batsum High is very snarky, very sarcastic, and that is similar to Davis in The Jester's Son. So I thought, hey, let's write from that viewpoint or from a similar viewpoint and kind of get warmed up so that here in January, as I start The Jester's Son, which is in about 4 or 5 days, which is kind of crazy to think about, um, I'll be a little bit warmed up in terms of writing, hopefully humorously. So that's Batsum High. That's kind of the last big project for this year. I've got two short stories that are in varying states of completeness. One is called Barnaby Bellows' Guide to Ghoul Gardening. That is a kind of a continuation of the bedtime story ghoul theme, written from the perspective of a professor of ghoul gardening, which is how you raise your own ghoul. That's been a lot of fun. That's also written in first person from kind of a humorous, quirky perspective. I'd say that's about 60% done. It's not a priority for me. It's more of just kind of a fun project that I turn to from time to time. But I plan to share that when it's done. And then another project is a Lollyland story. So this is another bedtime of a kid that is drifting off to sleep and sort of wakes up / is in a place called Lollyland where everything is made out of candy. He thinks it's wonderful, but as he explores, life is not quite as great as it seems, and he's got to help the locals. So, kind of in the early stages with that. I'm just introducing the conflict. I would say I'm about 30% through that story, but that'll be another bedtime story. Oh, so that is really 2024. What I'd like to do here in the last couple minutes is just turn to 2025 and round out a couple of those thoughts. The focus of the new year is going to be on the Jester's Son. Like I said earlier, I think that's going to be in that 150,000 to 175,000 word range. I would really love to have most of that or all of that done in 2025. This year was one of variety. Like I said towards the start, there's 10 to 15 projects that we touched over the course of the year. I have a feeling it's going to be less than that next year because the time is going to be directed into the novel. So what I'd like to do is sort of weave in these bedtime stories, and I had considered sort of recording a whole episode about my plans on how I'm going to approach this novel. And in that, what I would say, I don't think I will, just to keep things brief here for us, but what I'll say is I want to avoid the flavor fatigue risk of, sinking, let's say, 700 hours into the Jester's Son in 2025 and, hitting a wall at 550 and saying, there's a lot left. I'm not interested in rounding third base and taking this one home. And I think what might help keep that flavor fatigue low is introducing new projects sort of as needed. So the goal right now is, let's write 3 or 4 chapters of the Jester's Son, and then let's take a little breather and write a bedtime story. And then let's do another chapter 2, bedtime story, chapter 2 or 3, bedtime story. So by weaving in these shorter stories, it's kind of like that cleanser between meals, because I eat at a lot of those restaurants. Yeah, right. But weaving those short stories in, I think, will help keep Jester's Son fresh. It'll also give me a space to practice particular mechanics that I think will be helpful for the upcoming chapters. So, like I said earlier, regarding the Jester's Son outline, the themes move in particular ways in the story, and I think if I can identify a skill set that I'm going to need for kind of that upcoming thematic chunk of chapters, I can emphasize that skill in the bedtime story, and then I can get a little more batting practice before kind of the lights are on and it's the real deal with Jester's Son. So the long-term goal of that is if I finish drafting Jester's Son in 2025, then in 2026, the two main projects would be, let's round out that bedtime story collection, and let's do the revision, do the editing on Jester's Son. And ideally, that would not be the bulk of 2026. That would just be two kind of sizable projects, and there would be space for other interesting things. I'd have time to do something on the scale of, another book outline or a blueprint for something, or a handful of stories of similar scale to the Unbarren Castle. I'd have, a 300 or 400 hour chunk where I can play around with it. So that's the plan. I think next year is going to be a lot more focused than this year in terms of volume. There's going to be a lot, I think, more hours total. This year we wound up at about 415 hours. Just for my kind of rough estimates, I would say between 400 to 430 is probably pretty accurate. Next year I'm sort of updating or developing my work plan. So I'm having some more time in the mornings next year before work to kind of do some of this creative stuff. So I'm anticipating having about an hour and a half each morning, and doing the math, we'll have a little more time. So an hour and a half to 2 hours each morning, and that'll get us closer to that kind of 700 hour mark, and hopefully give us enough time to really do some of these larger projects that really are satisfying and pay off in the long run. So that's the plan. Overall 2024 was an awesome year. I think the thing I'm most proud of or most satisfied with is the litmus test for this podcast for me is that I enjoy doing it and I'm satisfied with it just by virtue of doing it. I'm sure there's some quotes out there, but regarding the joy of doing something for the sake of it. And I've found that to be the case with this podcast. Maybe this will be a time capsule someday where there are more listeners, but right now there are not. There are not many listeners at all. And that does not deter me at all. That is totally fine. And like I sort of alluded to earlier, the litmus test is how do I feel about investing this time creating these episodes for my own sake and not for a large audience. And the answer is very good. So I'm satisfied and I'm happy to continue that trend and to continue investing in this podcast because I think it makes me a better writer, and it's a good thing to do, and it's what I'd like to do. So if you've listened at all through this year to these episodes, I really appreciate it. It's been a lot of fun, and I hope that there are fun things coming up here in 2025 for the podcast and for you. So thank you very much.